Hello, and thank you for viewing my presentation entitled African American Genealogy and Introduction. Genealogy has always been a part of me because I was blessed to be raised around a family who prioritized passing down oral histories. And for that, I'm deeply blessed. Maybe some of you have had that same experience, or maybe some of you have experienced a situation where, the older family members made the kids leave the room because grown folks was talking, you know what I mean? And maybe you know very little about your family history, and maybe you feel like it's impossible to know. Well, I'm here to tell you it most definitely is not. There's a myth out there that African Americans can't trace their ancestry because of the legacy of slavery. That we weren't counted in or documented. Well, that's simply not true. And I have the receipts for you today. So today I'm going to show you that with persistence, consistency, exhaustive researching skills, and resourcefulness, you can unlock some incredible mysteries. And today I'm going to share a few examples of how I approached different scenarios in my family that showed methodology and introduce to you different record types and resources that can help you get started, okay? So first, let's talk about what is genealogy. Well, there's the basic definition that I would pretty much think everybody would agree with, which is tracing one's lineage to an ancestor in a specific point in time. But the expanded definition that, in my humble opinion, African Americans should vigorously pursue is this one that says researching one's family history by gathering facts to piece together a story or build a narrative about their ancestors' lives within the context of history and the places they live. You see, I take issue with the fact that our stories are treated as contrary to or clashing with the American mainstream, when in fact, our stories are as American as you're going to get. But the mainstream will never understand that unless we put forth effort to tell our own stories. So why would you want to trace your family history? Well, there's several benefits, right? I mean, first, you can build a connection to your family's past and legacy. Develop a sense of who you are and where you come from. And then secondly, there's preservation, cherishing the oral histories of the ancestors, old photos, relics, and documents. Next, you develop a sense of identity, who you are and where you come from. You might have always asked that question of yourself is why do we do what we do? Why we all say what we say? Why y'all think what you think? And why certain values were passed down from generation to generation. See, those are things that have to do with context, because context will give you these things, right? And the last one is truth. I'll tell you a little story. I was probably the serial liar of my family, to put it kindly. My mama used to say, boy, you need to start telling the truth because the truth will always set you free. Well, I can tell you that that has never been truer for me than in genealogy. And I always tell people, genealogy is not for the faint of heart. You must be prepared to face the unexpected and think outside the box of your known reality. And whether it's through traditional research methods or DNA testing, you need to be ready to possibly have your world turned upside down. But know that there is nothing more liberating than the truth. I can promise you that. So how do you get started? Well, first thing we want to do is start with what you know. Write down your known facts about your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, and so forth. The areas they lived in, the time periods, and things like that. But also know when you're collecting all that information, that's really a very good opportunity to go back to your oldest living relatives and ask the right questions of the right people. In my experience, I found that if you want to know the 411 on a family or a history, you need to talk to the oldest living daughters. That's not always the case, but I've seen, particularly in African American families, the oldest girls and their mothers, and sometimes even the grandmothers, are all very close, and they usually confide in one another. There are genealogical benefits to relationships like that, because those ladies will be holding on to gold. But the main objective is, just get them talking, engage them in conversation about their childhood. Who were their oldest living relatives and family members that they remember? Where did they go to school or church? What did their people do for a living? And make sure you record them. All right. Now, once you've gathered the facts, decide what you want to learn and prepare research questions to help you get started. And actually, the next 2 bullet points here, we'll be spending a lot of time talking about familiarizing yourself with available records and identifying public resources. I'll be introducing different types of record sets and where to find them. All right. And then lastly, you want to evaluate your findings and develop new questions. With this last point here, this is really a lifelong process, and it's designed to help you keep moving and maintain momentum. All right, so let's talk about the available record sets. And literally each one of these can be its own presentation. First, there's vital records. Vital records, generally speaking, are births, deaths, and marriage records. And then there's census records. For those that don't know, the United States population has been enumerated every 10 years since 1790. And every decennial census has been available to the public once it's 72 years old. Case in point, the 1950 census was just released this year, which is 2002. And that's because it's now 72 years old. But let me give you a little bit of information about the 1890 census. That census was destroyed in a flood that was caused by a fire. And so there aren't very many records. I mean, there's some, but there's not very many records left of the 1890 census. So it's kind of a wash. But what we also have are military records. And for those who are familiar with, who've been in the military or know someone that's been in the military, and you're familiar with, record types such as DD-214s or compiled military service records or pension files. I'm going to be talking about pension files in great detail during this presentation. There's also estate records, things like wills and probates and trusts and bills of sale, minute books, etc. There's also land records, conveyances, deeds, grants, patents issued under the Homestead Act would be those types of records. And then we have tax records. And then there's the Freedmen's Bureau records. Now, let me stop on this one for a minute, because this one is a big one, particularly for African Americans. During Reconstruction, Congress passed a bill to create what was known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Now, you could basically consider this the original FEMA. That's what I like to call it anyway, because it was set up to aid the war-torn South and help rebuild it. They helped Blacks and whites by providing food and clothing. They helped them set up schools and hospitals. But mostly, the Bureau helped the 4 million newly freed people establish their citizenship by legalizing marriages. They also helped them reunite with loved ones who were sold away during slavery. They helped them establish labor contracts with landowners, which is actually what began the sharecropping system. But also, they attempted to protect the civil rights under the Constitution for Black people. They would also investigate and prosecute any criminal acts of rape, assaults, and lynchings, and things of that nature. The next record is obituaries, newspaper death notices, and funeral programs. If you've been a collector of those, or anyone in your family, older relatives, has been a collector of those, you will find those to be absolute gold mines. But in the event that you don't have those, particularly like death notices, we now have historical newspapers that are available. A lot of them are online now. Some of them are microfilmed in libraries and archives, but the major ones, the 3 major ones that I can think of off the top of my head that have a lot of a wealth of information online are newspapers.com, which is owned by Ancestry now. And then we have one of my favorites, which is genealogybank.com, because I'm a Louisiana researcher. So there's a wealth of information in their record sets. And then there's a free one called Chronicling America. Let me say that again, chroniclingamerica.loc.gov, which is hosted by the Library of Congress on their website. And so, when all else fails and you've hit too many brick walls in your research, you can also try DNA testing. And that can help some of your walls come crashing down because you may find out about connections that you didn't previously know about. Okay, so the last bullet point that I said I would cover is identifying public resources. Again, even all of these research repositories that I'm about to mention, they literally could be their own presentation. We have state and local libraries where you can find records, public and private universities. Then there's historical societies. And I don't just mean historical societies as places to go visit as the other two that I mentioned, but also organizations that you can become a member of. I'm a member of the African American Genealogical Society of Northern California, which is an organization based in Oakland, but we have members all around the country. And you know, I'd like to think that I grew up in that organization. Like that organization helped me become the genealogist that I am today. When you join us, a society like that, you're blessed to be able to be around some of the most fabulous people with amazing skill sets who can teach you how to do this and are very passionate about it. There's also there's courthouses. Now, when it comes to courthouses, when you're looking for particular ancestors who lived in certain areas, you want to go to the courthouses in those areas because you'll find a wealth of information there, as well as cemeteries where your ancestors may have died and been buried. And then there's also online resources. And I've already mentioned a few like ancestry.com. There's also, now that's a paid subscription, but there's also familysearch.org, which is free. There's other paid subscriptions such as Fold3, and that's a website, fold3.com, which houses military records online dating back to the American Revolution. There's also online newspaper repositories, like I mentioned in the last slide. The National Park Service site is good if you're researching veterans. And then there's a wonderful tool to help you if you're searching in the Freedmen's Bureau records that I mentioned earlier. It's called Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau, which is it's an awesome tool that can help you. All right, so now I want to get into some of my case studies. This one here has to do with a beautiful woman that you see, the beautiful woman that you see here, which is my grandmother. She was very special to me, the late Leona Whitley Williams. And my grandmother, I was raised with her a lot of my childhood, and she taught me to memorize 7 generations of my maternal ancestry from my origins. And so, you know, she really was an amazing woman. Both her and her parents were like walking almanacs. Those are her parents that you see right there walking down the steps. And I can honestly tell you, if it were not for Mama, as I called her, as we all affectionately called her, I would not be speaking before you today and talking on these topics. I owe her everything because I am what I am today because of her. And so here are some of those matriarchs that she told me about, starting with her mother, Nan Earl Fleming Whitley, who was affectionately known as, everybody called her Mutzi. She actually died when I was a year old. And then there's Mutzi's mother, Cora Page Fleming, and Cora's mother, Fanny Shields Page. And of course, all of their maiden names are listed as their middle names. And there are more matriarchs who I unfortunately do not have pictures of, but they are Fanny's mother, who was known as Nellie Shields Washington, and her mother, who was a slave woman who was said to have come from Africa, but I have not validated that yet at this point. But her name was Binky, B-I-N-K-Y. And they were all slaves of a man by the name of, or their slave owner's surname was Shields. In the family, they just used to say Master Shields. And so for the purposes of this presentation and helping you understand research methodology using oral history, I'm going to focus a little bit on Cora for a minute. So back in 2002, Mama had told me a story about her grandmother, Cora, who was a resident of New Orleans at the time. And she was stricken with terminal cancer. And she said that her mother, Nan Earl, went down to New Orleans from Berkeley, coming from Berkeley by train, and brought her back to California to take care of her. And Mama said that Cora pretty much had not lived no more than a year in California before she died. And so when I'd asked Mama, I said, well, how old were you? How old were you when that happened? And she said I was about 22 years old. Well, I specifically asked that question because I knew when my grandmother was born. She always talked about her birth date, which was 1924. So with that information, I could surmise that this event occurred roughly around 1946. And with that, I was able to formulate my research question, which was, where would I be able to find Cora's death certificate, right? And so we go to the next slide here. Naturally, I figured that, well, if Cora died in the house in Berkeley, that's Alameda County. So I figured, well, the Alameda County Courthouse in Oakland would have that information. This is the website, acgov.org. Now, it didn't look like this 20 years ago, but this is where you would go for vital records, such as births, deaths, and marriage certificates, which are recorded in the counties or the parishes where your ancestors live. And through this website, I was able to order this death certificate for Cora. And it states all the facts and corroborates my grandmother's story. And so I'm gonna zoom in here for you a little bit. And as you can see here, it shows the date of death, which is August 8th, 1946. The duration of residence, or it says in this community, she was there 7 months in California. So that's consistent with what my grandmother said. Cause of death, carcinoma, which is cancer. She had carcinoma in the rectum, and it basically metastasized to her liver. And the location was 1341 Derby Street, which was my great-grandparents' house. And I was practically, my entire family, we're all raised in that house. That was the family hub. So I knew this was the correct document, obviously. But the other piece of information that is down here, and this is the gold mine really, is it lists her parents, Jack Page of Louisiana and Fanny Shields of Louisiana. And the informant was George Fleming, which was Cora's oldest son. So he's the one who provided it. Okay. And so, that's an example. Those are examples of how you can find information based on the oral history that you receive and how to research it. Okay. But now I want to go over a case study where you're searching for information or trying to research your family history with very little information to go on. So these are pictures on my father's side. Here we have this spiffy gentleman here to the far left, Sanders Willis Jr. That's my father. And then after the middle picture is his father, Sanders Willis Sr., who's dressed just as well as he is. And then we have my great grandmother, Artemise Benton Willis Jackson, who was Sanders Sr.'s mother, who we all in the family, we affectionately called her grandmama. And so according to grandmama, she was 15 years old when her mother died, and her mother's name was Mamie Benton. At least that was the name we had on record, Mamie Benton. And the story goes is that Mamie died in Gramercy, Louisiana, which was in St. James Parish, and it forced grandmama and her father, Edward Benton, to have to raise her younger brothers and sisters because grandmama was the oldest. And her father, Edward, had moved the family from Gramercy to Baton Rouge because that's where all his family was originally based. And that was roughly around, like if you were to drive by a car, that's about 30 minutes away, but we're talking early 1910. So I doubt that they had a car at that time. But for at least 10 years, I had asked my family members, what was Mamie's maiden name? And do you believe that no one knew? I mean, no one knew. Her grandchildren didn't know. I figured, well, the only other option that I have is to order a copy of Mamie's death certificate from Louisiana State Archives, where death records are recorded in the state that are, if they're 51 years or older, they're kept there, okay? But they have to be 51 years or older. If not, they're kept in another location where they're not available to the public. And so as you can see on this record, we have Mamie's name, or I'm sorry, we have Gramercy, Louisiana. So the location is accurate, just like grandmama said, it's St. James Parish. And we have her name, Mamie Benton. That's what was recorded with the parish. We also have the date of death, December 23rd, 1917. Now I know that grandmama was born in 1902. So her story that she was 15 years old, this pretty much lines up, right? And then it tragically shows that she was only 38 38 years old at the time of her death, unfortunately. But doing the math, that would put her birth year around 1879. But the unfortunate thing is, unlike, Grandma Cora's death certificate, this one had no information on her parents, or not even, didn't have where she was born, and didn't even have an informant. And that kind of suggested to me that either she could have died, without any family members present, or at least when it was recorded with the parish coroner, that it wasn't a family member who provided this information. So I was stuck. And like I said, 10 years, I went without knowing this information. So, but then something changed, because I'm a subscriber of Ancestry.com. And for nearly 20 years, I've utilized their services, and I've, found them to be fantastic. I'm constantly checking their records. For the last 20 years, I just regularly log in and I check to see what new databases they load. Same thing with, FamilySearch.org. And they're constantly, both of those websites or companies are constantly updating their records. And I'd say about 10 years ago, they added the Social Security application and claims index, or at least that's when I first saw it. And apparently, Grandmama's baby brother had applied for a Social Security number. And when that application was recorded, he provided his mother's maiden name, which is Penny. And so for the first time in 10 years, I was able to finally hit gold, hit the jackpot, and find out what the surname was. So now that I know the Penny name, now that I can research the Penny name, my research started to snowball like nobody's business. I mean, I found this document, which is a 1900 census, on a man by the name of Jackson Penny. And so if you look here, it says Baton Rouge is in the city of Baton Rouge. This is June of 1900. And if we zoom in on this document, we show here Jackson Penny, head of household, his wife Marie, and their children, David, Mary, Ella, Elise, Odile, and a grandson named James. Now, I've since come to find out Odile was also known as someone named Della. That's primarily what she was called. The Ella, her real name was Luella, but everybody called her Ella. Elsie is probably, I think her name was Elise or Elise. And also notice that Jackson and his wife, Jackson stated on the census that he was born in Missouri, and that Marie stated that she was born in Alabama, although she stated her parents were from Georgia. Okay. So my suspicion was that this Mary here was my Mamie Benton, but I wasn't quite sure. Like, this just wasn't enough information for me to feel like this was a slam dunk. Although I will say her birth year here, 1877, that's only 2 years off of what the death certificate said. So it's plausible that it's her, but I just needed a little bit more information to really conclude that this was it, right? So I then found this index record. I found an index record for their marriage certificate on FamilySearch.org. And I called the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse with that information and ordered this particular document here. And so it shows Miss Mary Penny married to Edward Benton, but below that, highlighted here in yellow, you will see the names Dave Penny and Mrs. Mary Penny. So Dave Penny we saw on the census. Mrs. Mary Penny, I presume, is also Marie, right? And how I was able to really slam dunk this and know for sure that this was my family were these two names here, Katie Jackson and Nellie Jackson. I knew from previous research that these were Edward Benton's half sisters. So it was quite clear this was the correct marriage certificate. So now, I know, it's now been confirmed, the Penny name. So I continued searching this family, and I jumped back to the 1880 census, because remember, in 90% of the 1890 census was destroyed. So I didn't bother looking for that. But in the 1880 census here, notice that Jack, let me zoom in here. Jack Penny, states again that he was born in Missouri, but notice where he says his father's from, Africa, and his mother from Tennessee. So I just want to stop right here and tell you that this is the one and only time in my 20 years of research that I have ever discovered one of my ancestors actually documented to be from Africa. And I'm still on the hunt to try to figure out. I know his name, well, he went by two names, but now I'm trying to figure out exactly where he came from, and that'll take me some time. But Marie, or his wife Maria, here listed here 29, she again states she was born in Alabama and consistently states that her parents were from Georgia. And then the last thing I want to point out here is, if you notice the children, the oldest is David, who's 8. And so given that this is the 1880 census, you would expect that when you go back to the 1870 census, these children won't be there, right? They wouldn't be born. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we see here is Jack and Maria married at the time, but with no children. So they were probably more than likely recently married. So now I want to take a moment here to point out the significance of looking at this 1870 census. You know, all the census schedules only document free inhabitants, except for the 1850 and 1860 census, which they were known as the slave schedules. And you may have seen some of those documents. If you've ever watched Dr. Henry Louis Gates' show, Finding Your Roots, you know, he's gone over those and shown lists of slaves that are only documented by age, sex, and maybe possibly color, but they're never named. Their names are never listed unless they're over 100 years old. So it's all because African Americans were enslaved prior to 1865. And so this is the first census where Black people were counted and documented. And we refer to this period as the 1870 brick wall because it's very difficult for researchers to identify and or locate their ancestors by name beyond this point, at least without the name of a slaveholder or slaveholders to help you connect the dots. But looking at this document, this begs to ask several questions, like, where were my people between 1865 and 1870? Were these two people here, Jack and Maria, were they married prior to 1870? Were they enslaved people or were they born free? Can I identify potential slaveholders for them? Was Maria even Jack's first wife? And another question is, you know, was Jack a United States colored troop in the Civil War? Since looking at his age, he would have been old enough to serve. So at this point, this is where skilled researchers do in-depth, comprehensive research into specialized record sets, you know, like the Freedmen's Bureau records that I mentioned earlier, but it would take looking into those specialized record sets to answer some of these types of questions. And so, you know, when you look at the last question that I asked about the Civil War records, well, I was able to actually answer that question about Jack's service because I found this item on FamilySearch.org. This image comes from their Civil War pension index card collection. Now, all of these cards are scanned and digitized on FamilySearch.org. And these cards are like gold to a researcher because they lead to what? Pension files, Civil War pension files. And this particular card shows that Jack served in 2 regiments. He served in what was known as a militia known as the Corps d'Afrique, which was the Regiment 8, Company G of the Corps d'Afrique infantry. And then later on, those militias were then intertwined they were transitioned into the U.S. colored troops or the United States Army. And it was then reorganized as Regiment 80, Company G of the United States Colored Infantry. So that's what those abbreviations mean. And you'll also notice here that in 1890, Jack himself had applied for an invalid pension, which is a disability pension. But in 1902, his wife, who was his widow by this time, had also filed for a widow's pension after his death. So we, at least looking at this, we can see that he died sometime between 1890 and 1902. And you see the application numbers that were filed when they submitted those claims. But what you also see next to that in blue are these certificate numbers. And so the certificate numbers are proof that in both cases, both Jack and his wife and Maria were eligible and received benefits. So they were awarded benefits. But in cases where the applications are rejected, you won't see a certificate number. And so that's how you can tell whether it was approved or rejected. But remember, just because you don't see a certificate doesn't mean there isn't a pension file. Sometimes the rejections have more genealogical information than the approved ones. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Civil War pension files. Few things to note. Most Union soldiers, their widows or minor children applied for pensions. In some cases, their parents who were in some cases, their dependents also applied for the pensions. The invalid pensions contain incredible detailed medical information on a soldier post-Civil War. So when they file those claims, they're reporting all of these injuries and ailments that they have, and they're making claims that a lot of these were caused by their service in the war. The widow's pension files, they can be literally up to 100 pages long. They will provide the bulk of the genealogical data that you're looking for. I have some that are anywhere between 65 to 100 pages long, and the wealth and treasure trove of genealogical information in these files are unbelievable. So if you are ever blessed to have one, know that you're sitting on a gift. Okay, so there are many types of documents that you'll find in a pension file, and for time's sake, I can only show you a few. But you might come across one like this one, which is Jack's discharge papers. Now, this would have been a critical document for Maria's application to show proof of her husband's service. So here, what you'll see is it contains here, let me zoom in. You see it has his regiment and rank at the time of his discharge. So you see that he was a sergeant of Company G of Regiment 80. He was enrolled on October 2nd, 1863, and he served 3 years. So you've got his enlistment date and his time served. It even goes on to say that he was discharged in 1867 in New Orleans. And he was, at that time, he was 24 years old, and he stated that he was born in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. So looking at this right here, you just got a wealth of information on a man who was born during slavery. Here, we have a document where Maria would have provided proof of his death in her application packet. And so we see his death signed by the attending physician down here. And this record indicates the birthplace of his mother, Tennessee, which is consistent with what he reported on the census record, right? Which was the 1880 census that I showed you earlier. All right, so here's the real meat of a Civil War pension file. There were special examiners who would be appointed to review these claims and meet with claimants, and they would take depositions and affidavits from them. They would take it from them, their friends, their associates too, and that would be to evaluate the merits of the case for determinations. And these interviews would uncover incredible, detailed personal information about the lives of these individuals, which, would be comprehensive genealogical information, right? So here we have my third great grandmother, Maria Penny's deposition, in which she provides detailed information on her life, meeting her deceased husband, and any details that she knew about him prior to the time she met him, right? And this is documented. This interview was conducted December 1st, 1903. And so the document reads here, I'll just read this little section for you. It says, I first saw the soldier before he was mustered out of the service while going from Jonesville, Texas to Marshall, Texas. We got acquainted on the train, and he fell in love with me at once, and he began writing to me afterward. But we became engaged on the train, and I preceded him to Shreveport 2 weeks, and when he got there, I went on the same boat he did from there to New Orleans, and a month after he was mustered out, he married me at the house of his brother, Arch Penny, at St. Anne Street, which was in New Orleans. So right there, we have a wealth of information and a timeline. We know from the discharge papers that he mustered out of the war in 1867 in New Orleans. So what her story lines up with that, and she's telling you, she's saying, hey, he was on his way to finishing his 3 years of service when he met me, the woman of his dreams. And after all he'd been through, he was ready to settle down. So, but also notice that she says he wrote her, which implies to me he was a literate Black man. And that's saying a lot for a man who was born in prior to slavery ending. And so through that correspondence, they had agreed to meet in Shreveport, get on a boat, go to New Orleans, and get married at his brother's house. So she continues, and as she continues, she's dropping bombshells left and right. She says, I was married under the name of Maria Green, which was my maiden name, Green, being my father's name. I was born in Macon County, Alabama, 6 miles from the town of Lochapoka. We lived right on the line of Tallapoosa's County. My father and mother and myself all belonged to Russ Bridges in Alabama. Bombshell information right there. She just gave you a slave owner's name, which then opens the door for you to look through that slave owner's records if you can find them. And it says, she said, and after the war broke out, they took us to Texas for safekeeping. They lived only 6 miles from Marshall, Texas. I was hired out by a man in Jonesville, Texas, named Lang, who was a furniture dealer. The Langs had some small children, but I don't recall the names of any of them. I was only 15 years old when I married Jack. So you can imagine when I saw this information, mouth open, tears were welling up. It's like, this is just incredible. And she goes on talking about her husband. She says, well, he told me he was born and raised in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. I suppose it was the county by the name, but may have been the town he was raised in. Well, she's right in both cases because Cape Girardeau, Missouri is both a city and a county. And she said, he told me he belonged to a man named Penny who raised wheat. He said he used to cut wheat. So now I know. So now look at all of these clues that I have. I mean, bombshells. So now I know that his slave owner had the same last name, and that he was his plantation was a wheat plantation. So and this was somewhere around Cape Girardeau, Missouri, or somewhere in the state of Missouri. So don't you think I'd be searching Missouri records for plantation owners who own wheat plantations? So. And then she goes on to say, no, sir, the soldier never had a picture taken in the Army. He had she says he had one taken soon after the war, but he gave that to his mother, Elsie Penny. So I've seen her name spelled a million different ways. There's Elsie, Elise. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but the bottom line is I have our name, right? And she goes on to say that Elsie has since died, but she says, I think his brother Arch Penny of Champaign, Illinois, must have that picture now. The only photograph I have of the soldier was taken 23 years ago, and that was taken while he was at church and nearly asleep. And the picture is badly faded, but still, anyone who knew the soldier can see a very striking resemblance between the picture and the soldier. He was sitting outside the Mount Zion church with his head down. I will loan you the picture. So right there, she's telling you that one, Archie Penny migrated from New Orleans to Champaign, Illinois, which I was able to go look through census records and find records of his family there, but also that there were at least 2 pictures that existed of her husband. And so ever since then, I've been trying to find, living family members who hopefully would have those pictures. So now, that I was able to uncover all of that with very little information to go on. And it wasn't until I got that last name, Penny, that the floodgates opened. Okay. So now I want to talk to you about another record set, probate records. And probate records can be a great source for genealogical information. And if you've ever experienced the passing of a close relative or loved one, then you may know about the probate process in probate court. So what is probate? Well, probate is it's the term for a legal process in which a will is reviewed to determine whether it's valid and authentic. But it's also a general administering of a deceased person's will or the estate of a deceased person without a will. So when someone dies, the court appoints either an executor named in the will or an administrator, if there is no will, to administer the process of probate. And all of the decedent's assets are collected and documented. And if the decedent has outstanding liabilities, then the decedent's estate must pay off all debts before the remaining assets can be distributed to the named beneficiaries. And land is one of the major assets that a person can have. And if a decedent was a landowner at the time of death, well, chances are there's a record of probate. So in this case study, I want to show you how vital information on a census record can give you clues to a probate. Now, I've taken you back to the 1900 census that I showed you earlier on the Penny family, and I want you to focus on the top right area of this document. Okay, so here in these final two columns for education and ownership of a home, there are several columns that we want to pay attention to. It's the ones between column 22 through column 27. So we have the categories asking, can you read, can you write, can you speak English? And then we have, does the person own or rent their home? Is it owned free and clear, or is it mortgaged? And is it a farm or a house? And so on line 63, Jack Penny stated that he can read, he can write, and he can speak English, which is consistent with what his wife said in the Civil War pension file. Then he goes on to say that he owns his home free and clear, and it is a house, not a farm. So again, I'm now faced with a new research question. Where can I find a record of land purchase? Well, the answer to that question lies in the East Baton Rouge Parish conveyance records, and these records detail the legal process of transferring property from one owner to another. So in this image that I found on familysearch.org, you'll see that there's two entries for Jack. The first one has to do with him being involved in a land purchase for a church. But it's the second one we want to focus on, because even though I didn't find a record of his purchase, I did find this record, the second record, which shows Maria purchasing the property from him in 1899. And this index record refers to this book that you see here. Now, for the sake of time, I'll just summarize what this document covers. If we zoom in here, it shows right here, Jack Penny to Maria Penny, one lot ground in Hickeytown. Price is $250. Okay, so that's showing that she bought this land from him for $250, and it goes on to state here that this sale and conveyance is made for the purpose of replacing and repaying to his said wife her separate peripheral funds to the amount of more than $300 in cash, which this vendor, which is him, has received from his said wife and converted to his own use. So the end game here was for him, he was trying to ensure that this land would go to her and the children before he died, because apparently his name was on the deed and hers wasn't. And this sale, like I said, was recorded in 1899, and that was just 3 years before he died. So I then decided to check the probate records to see if the property was in her possession at the time of her death. And guess what? It was. So in East Baton Rouge, the East Baton Rouge Parish probate record books, which span from 1808 to 1900, they're scanned and digitized and available online on Family Search. I mean, they have probate books that go beyond 1900, but the ones that are digitized and scanned on Family Search is from 1808 to 1900. But the index book, this particular index book that you see here, all of its pages are scanned and it goes up to 1924. Okay, so that's important, and I'll explain in a minute. So here, as you can see, I was able to find Maria's pension file, which is 3273, and it was recorded on November 10, 1921. So the land was in her possession for another 22 years after she purchased it from Jack. Now, if the images posted only run through 1900, but yet the index book shows that she purchased it in 1921, or I'm sorry, that her probate was recorded in 1921. How would I be able to obtain Maria's pension file? Well, all I had to do was just call the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse. I told them that I found this record on FamilySearch.org. I gave them the file number and the record date, and they just searched it and called me back in 30 minutes. And they asked me if I wanted to pay by credit card, and I said, yeah. And they sent this wonderful file within a week. And as you can see here, the petitioner is Della Penny Harrison, which is that last child that I showed you was on the census. Della Penny, she's the youngest child of Jack and Maria. And you see her name here. So Della goes on to state in this file when she petitioned with the court that her mother, Maria Penny, had died intestate, which meant that she died without a will in December of 1919. And that 3 of Maria's 4 children, which were Dave, Mary, and Ella, they had all preceded her in death, leaving Della the matriarch of the family and having to settle her mother's affairs. Now, notice that they all died within a 5-year span before their mother. How tragic is that? And, looking at it, if I look at this from grandmama's perspective, and even her first cousins, they lost their parents, their aunt, and their uncle, and their last living aunt moved to Chicago, which would have been Della. So I can understand why those connections to the Penny family were severed and no one knew the names. They had been severed for future generations. And it goes on to state that Mary Penny's children are heir to her portion, and the oldest being, it says here, Odamis, but that's actually Artemis. That's my grandma. And with her brothers and sisters, and of course it shows that they are the minors who are the minor children of Mary Penny and Eddie Benton. So please keep in mind that in lieu of direct heirs being deceased, it's their children are the ones who will be next in line to receive the inheritance, and that's why you see them listed in this probate record. Now, Della obviously was living, so her descendants wouldn't be listed in this probate. But it does go on to list the children of Ella Penny, as well as Dave. Ella's had 2 children, Elise Washington and Brenetta Humbles. And then you see here that David Penny, he had several Penny children. And of course, I've found descendants of these children. And of course, they obviously knew the name because their ancestor was male, the Penny name passed through them. But for Ella and Mary, it didn't. And that's why we didn't even know what the name was, and neither did Ella's descendants. So this new information, it helped me piece together my familial connections with living cousins that I didn't previously know. So in June of 2019, I subscribed to Ancestry DNA as well. And in June of 2019, I had a DNA match that popped up named Virginia Speed McDowell. She's the one on the far right. And she happens to be the great granddaughter of Ella Penny. And then Vanita Reed is I found out about her just through my traditional research, searching through the records. And Vanita I met her online, and it turned out that she was the granddaughter of Della Penny. And so we kind of, we all had an idea how we were related, but it was really that probate record that kind of tied it all together. So we all understood in detail how we were related, just because that probate record literally listed all of the living ancestors at that time. And so what you see here is Vanita Reed in the center with her daughter, Tanya Reed. In the top left corner, you see Della Penny Harrison, who was the petitioner on that probate record. And of course, at the bottom left corner is my grandmama, Artemis Benton Willis Jackson. And unfortunately, we don't have pictures of Mary or Mamie Penny and Ella Penny, and because they both died at 38 years old. And so unfortunately, we weren't able to get pictures of them, but I could at least show you a picture of my grandmama and her aunt Della, and you can see the resemblance between them. So now I want to show you an example of the types of property or estate records that you may find at archives, libraries, and universities once you identify a slave owner in your family. You know, sometimes these slave owning families, they donate their records to these places, and they will contain things like diaries and letters and various forms of correspondence. Sometimes they'll have logs of daily events like how many people chopped wood you know, that day, or how much wood was chopped that day, how much cotton was picked that day, how many socks and blankets they gave to their enslaved laborers that day. Sometimes they would even keep a daily record of illness, you know, how often or how long slaves were sick and couldn't perform their duties. They kept birth registers and death registers of slaves. And in miscellaneous financial papers, you'd find their names and their activities listed all over those papers. And so many years ago, as I began to uncover my paternal family roots and discover distant cousins, we became very close and developed a research team. And we all lived in different parts of the country, but we all had ties to Louisiana. So we all were committed to taking up the mantle of discovering our ancestors. And back in around 2011, we'd all been finding death certificates on our ancestors. I mean, we were on a roll with the information we were finding. And there was a common pattern that we started to see, which was that several of them were either born or died or both in an area known as either Wakefield or Wakefield Plantation, which was in St. Francisville, Louisiana, and that is in an area known as West Feliciana Parish. And we started to suspect that, well, maybe that's their ancestral home. Maybe that's where they were enslaved. And I had discovered a finding aid online that indicated the owner of Wakefield Plantation during the antebellum era was a man by the name of Colonel Lewis Sterling, who was a man born into a wealthy family of Irish Scottish immigrants, and he was one of the wealthiest planters in Louisiana, as his father and his father before him. And the document showed that the Sterling family papers were preserved at the LSU Special Collections Department. So I emailed that information to my cousin Kurt, who was one of those, Wakefield Plantation descendants. And he lived in Texas. So he drove over to LSU and found one of the most incredible documents that I have ever seen. This is the cover of what was known as the Record of the Births of Negroes, all now living. And it says, taken from old records this 24th day of February, 1857 by Lewis Sterling. Now, when you see that where it says it was taken from old records and you already know this is an old record, well, I mean, what could that possibly tell you? That, he was probably transcribing data from previous paperwork. And that paperwork, you would suspect probably, covered maybe another 2 generations previously. So what I can tell you from studying this document many, many times is that Lewis's father, who was also named Lewis, he documented the births of these slaves that went back to the 1810s in pencil. And then decades later, Lewis Jr. and several other relatives recorded deaths of these people before and after slavery, after the time of slavery and after the Civil War. Now, as weird as that may sound, I'm sure based on the oral histories that our family members had shared and the evidence that we'd uncovered, it was because we realized that those formerly enslaved and their former slave owners and their families, they were probably all family. And because they clearly maintained relationships after the war. And we know for a fact that Lewis Jr., or I'll call him Lewis II, he fathered at least 4 children from Kirk's 3rd great grandmother, who was an enslaved woman named Cecile. Well, she was in the records, her name is spelled many different ways. So we've narrowed it down to either Cecile, Celie, or Cecily. And Lewis not only fathered her children, he fathered many of the children on that plantation from different women, enslaved women on that plantation. And to our knowledge, he never had a wife or white children that we know of. So when we go to the first page of this birth register, um, if you look at the third entry here, Irvin, son of Levin and Big Judy, was born in May of 1810. Well, Levin and Big Judy were my fifth great grandparents. And the next entry you see, number 4, is Linda, daughter of, and you see a little D and like some quotes, was born in February of 1814. That was like a little symbol to represent ditto. So it's basically telling you that Linda is also the child of Levin and Judy. Well, Linda Weathers was my fourth great grandmother. Then I want to point you to entry number 35 here, which is Cecile, daughter of Linda. So now we know that the Cecile that I mentioned earlier, Kirk's third great grandmother, she was the daughter of Linda, born in January 17th, 1833. Now, if you'll notice, there's no father listed. And what we all pretty much surmise from studying this document over the course of many months, we began to realize that in cases where you would not see a father listed, 9 times out of 10, it was because their father was a white man, if not the plantation owner himself. So that's why they would never tell you who the father was in some of these cases. And how do we know that? Well, like I said earlier, several of us were pulling death certificates on these people. Once we found this document, we were trying to see if we could find the death certificates for any of these people that would have died in a time period when those deaths were being recorded. And we found this one, Cecil. It says Cecil Bryant this time, but then as you see below, they wrote Celie Bryant. And as you can see here, she's about 88 years old, born in Wakefield, Louisiana. And look at the name of her father. It looks like Virgin Bryant and Linda Morgan. Well, that is Linda Weathers, because Linda Weathers married a Black man named George Morgan, who was my fourth great grandfather. And so the Virgin Bryant, the father, it's actually Virgil Bryant, because I looked him up and studied him. And yes, he was a white male. He was a planter in the area. And how that happened when she was Cecile, I'm sorry, when she was when her mother was a slave of the Sterling family, I really couldn't tell you that, but this is what the facts show. And the informant of this information is Virgil Sterling, which is her son. And how do we know that? Well, if you look at entry level number 127 here, we have Virgil, son of Cecile, born February 7th, 1856 at night. And if you'll notice, he has no father listed either. But his last name, as I stated, that he signed as informant on her death certificate, was Virgil Sterling. Well, how do we know he was a Sterling? Because we also have his death certificate too, in which you see his name here, living in Wakefield, born in Wakefield. But look who his father is, Louis Sterling himself. And this was probably Louis number 2, not the first, based on the ages. And then of course his mother is listed. This here is a picture actually in the middle. That old gentleman in the middle is Virgil Sterling. And this picture of Virgil was confirmed, and all of the individuals confirmed in this picture, because many years ago, I think it was about 2012, my cousin Kurt went to the party. It was a birthday party for one of the oldest living relatives, Jeanette Sterling, who was, I think it was her 102nd birthday. And that is Jeanette on the far right holding the bouquet of flowers. And he showed her this picture, and she identified herself and everyone else in the picture, which were some of her other brothers and sisters. Because Virgil, by the way, had about 21 kids total. So then we go to the next entry that I want to show you, which is entry level 100, Martha, daughter of Linda and Long George. That would be George Morgan, but obviously as a slave, they called him Long George. And Martha was born July 8, 1851. That is my third great grandmother. So that would be Cecile's half sister. Now, This entry here is not a direct relationship to me, but it's one that I just want to point out for people who would not know this. Um, this entry number 75 is Antoinette, daughter of Henrietta, born June 19th, 1856. Well, Henrietta is the sister of Linda Weathers. Henrietta was also the daughter of Big Judy and Levin Weathers. But what I really want to talk about is Antoinette, because this gentleman above her, entry level number 74, that's Primus Sterling, son of Frosine, born on October 1st, 1844. Primus was a Sterling. He was Louis Sterling's son. That's why you don't see a father listed. And Primus married Antoinette. Now, why does this matter? Because for those who may remember Alton Sterling, the gentleman who was murdered by the police in 2013, 2016, out in Baton Rouge when he was outside of a liquor store selling CDs. These two individuals are his third great grandparents. And so I just wanted to point that out, that Alton Sterling is in fact my sixth cousin through Antoinette and Henrietta's line of Weathers, the Weathers family. So here are additional property financial record types that can help you identify your ancestors during slavery. Now, when the slave owner died, there would be probate sales to pay existing debts. Prior to that, the parish judge would ensure that, there was a record of inventory and appraisement on the decedent's property. And in this case, that inventory included enslaved people of African descent. So here you're looking at the inventory record of Josias Gray, which is dated the 26th of February, 1842, and he was a planter in West Feliciana Parish. So what I would like for you to focus on is the area in the bottom right corner. And if we zoom in on it here, it shows in the inventory, you see a Negro man named Nelson. That is Nelson Taylor Sr., my fourth great grandfather, who's aged 30 years and was appraised at $900. In today's dollars, that would be $26,183 today. And then we see his wife, a Negro woman named Litha. That's my fourth great grandmother, Litha Bryant Taylor, age 30 years, and their four children, Mandy, age 6, Little Nelson, which is Nelson Taylor Jr., that's my third great grandfather, who was married to the Martha Morgan in the birth register that I just showed you, that Martha and Nelson got married. Then there's Nelson's sister, Eliza, 2, and Malvina, who's 6 months old. Now, all of that family unit, excluding Nelson, the father, were appraised at $2,100, as you can see to the far right. That today would be $34,911. So you can start to really understand the value of slaves. I know it's hard to look at these slaves with these monetary values behind their names, but also understand that when it came to assets, when it came to property, when it came to estates, the most valuable asset that people had, citizens in the South had in the United States, were their slaves. They were worth more than their land, worth more than their house, worth more than their mules and everything else. So you can understand why this was such a big business. Now, I didn't even include the next page because when you turn the page, there's one more child, and her name was Sarah. She was 14. And she was itemized separately, obviously, because of at the age of 14, that's considered childbearing years. So I know this is very difficult to see, and I know it's a very sensitive subject for some, and it's cringeworthy, right? But as I stated earlier in my presentation, genealogy is not for the faint of heart, like I said, and even though that this can be a painful process, and to witness this, to bear witness to what our ancestors went through. Um, for me, I look at it as, you know what? Yes, they went through it, but they endured this. They endured this for me. Their dreams were deferred for me, so that I could stand here before you today and give you this truth. Um, and because of that, I will speak their names for the rest of my life. And I vow to never let my children forget who these people were. So earlier, I talked about the Freedmen's Bureau and its role during Reconstruction to help African Americans adjust as newly freed people and citizens of the United States. So this right here is an example of the labor contracts that I spoke of earlier, where agreements were established between planters and sharecroppers for the newly freed laborers to earn a living wage. So the first part of this document details the labor agreement and the terms and the conditions, but the bottom half lists the names of the laborers. So if you look at this sixth entry right here, that's my third great grandfather, Nelson Taylor Jr. And of course, his name had to be on the crease of the paper where you can hardly see it, right? But if I try to, zoom in or blow it up here for you, maybe hopefully it's a little clearer for you. But that is the man known as Little Nelson. And there's many names on this list that I did recognize, and this just comes from years of collective research between me and my cousins. Like I said, looking through census records, death records, estate records, all of these things started to show a pattern and matches. And like I said, Little Nelson here is listed at 28 years old. And this is, this document is dated 1867. Well, I have his marriage record to Martha Morgan, and they were married in 1869. So this is clearly before he marries her. And what you also see here is Jim Morgan and Luke Morgan at 18 and 22 years old, respectively. These two individuals are Martha's older brothers. And if we go further down the page, we see a very familiar name, Cecile Bryant, who's 35 years old. She was Martha's older half sister. We also see this Frances Irving, which is actually Frances Irvine. If you notice her age, she's 23 years old, which means she was born around 1842. But she is actually the baby sister of Little Nelson. She wasn't mentioned in that inventory record for Josiah's grave that I mentioned earlier, because remember, that record was dated in 1842. So this child was born 2 years later, and she's under her married name because she married him. She was a Frances Taylor, but she married a man named John Irvine. And then at the bottom here, we see Martha, as a single, as a single woman. She's 15 years old. So it's just 2 years before she marries her husband. And then she's also listed here with her baby sister, Rosalie Morgan, who was the youngest of about 15 children. And of course, at the bottom, look who approved and executed this contract, Colonel Lewis Sterling himself. So like I said, even though this is after slavery, they're still working for this man. They're still living with him. And they stay, and if you just follow the census records over the decades, they stayed in that area and on that land for generations. So let's talk a little bit about DNA and DNA analysis. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into DNA research because this topic of all others is very comprehensive, and it can definitely be its own presentation as well. As a matter of fact, I've done several presentations on DNA, and I usually have to do it in 2 parts because it's just too much information to cover. But what I want to show you is how DNA can corroborate or contradict your research and your narratives. Because like I said earlier, when all else fails, you can, try DNA analysis. So in this example, from Ancestry DNA, you can see that Virginia, my cousin that I mentioned earlier, is predicted to be 3rd cousin to my father, Sanders Willis, which is consistent with the research, because if you look at the pedigree chart here, we see Maria Green Penny with 2 of her children, Mamie and Ella, who we know are siblings, The next generation would be first cousin. The next generation after that would be second cousin, which is my grandfather and Elise Washington's son, Lionel Newman. And then third cousin would be my father and my cousin Virginia, right? So it matches up. But if you click on the shared matches link here, you'll see others listed in this fashion, from most closely related to most distantly related. And notice that for each match, Ancestry DNA predicts the level of relationship that person is to you, not the match that you're analyzing. So in other words, we're looking at my dad's account. I mean, I manage his account, but these matches their relationships are stated in relationship to him and not Virginia. And I mention that because some people get confused when they see this and they think that those relationships are from the reference point of the match you're analyzing, and that's not the case. And then also notice that Virginia shares more DNA with my dad than you see CHIV Reed. Well, that's my cousin Vanita Reed, who I mentioned earlier. And you'll notice that Virginia is actually sharing a little bit more DNA than Vanita. And Vanita is actually my father's second cousin once removed. So technically, if you just base it off the pedigree, Vanita is technically more closely related to my father than Virginia is. Genetically, you would think that you would see her share more DNA. So this is an unusual situation because usually the more closely related two people are, the more DNA they share. And that's measured in centimorgans. And that's why you see the little CM after the number, because that's what that stands for. That's the metric for measuring DNA. But in this case, the reason why Virginia and my dad share more DNA than with Vanita is because recently I spoke to Virginia and we started talking about our pedigrees and just other branches of our family, and come to find out we are actually related on other branches, at least 2 other branches of our family trees that are totally disassociated from the penny line. So that's what accounts for the increase in shared DNA. So I say that to lead me to this DNA tip that I want to give you, which is, you have to be careful when you're looking at your matches, because you may share DNA or those matches, they may be matches related to you in multiple ways, not just the way that you're focusing on. And an example, and just to add to that, if I show you this guy at the bottom, he's not a penny descendant. He's actually a descendant through, if you look here on his paternal grandmother's side, the Rosetta Jenkins side, well, he's a descendant of Jonas Jenkins. Jonas Jenkins was my 3rd great grandmother and Jenkins' brother. And then I've seen the Emorys related on some of my other cousins who are my DNA matches. They descend from Emorys. And from talking to Virginia, she also was connected to the Emorys as well as the Jenkins. So like I said, sometimes your shared matches may be related to you in other ways that you probably haven't even discovered yet. So you have to be careful when you're looking at your matches. You can't jump to conclusions or make assumptions, which of course leads me into this slide, which has to do with common pitfalls. And you got to be careful about, like I said, about jumping to conclusions. I know sometimes, especially if we've been doing this for years, we got it stuck in our head that whatever we were told is the truth must be the truth because that's what we were always told. But I encourage a lot of you, if you're doing this for the first time, you're new to researching, you got to keep your mind open. You got to keep your mind open to all types of possibilities, because you never know what the truth is until you really start digging. Because if you stay locked in on what you were told versus what you can prove, you may be closing not only your mind, but you may be shutting the door to finding incredible evidence on your family, all because you told yourself that that couldn't possibly be the case. So I encourage you not to make that mistake. And it's a very common mistake that genealogists can make. Also, you want to make sure you fact check your sources. I can't stress this one enough because, and especially for those who like subscribe to sites like Ancestry, where you're looking at your hints and your hints lead you to other people's trees, and then you start downloading information from those trees. Be careful, because if those individuals who have those trees have not provided fact-based information, they're not providing any documentation to back up the claims they're making, you could be just duplicating erroneous information, and it could set you back a long time. Okay. And then organizing yourself, I feel like I shouldn't even be the one talking to you about this, because this is something that I wish when I got started that I'd had done a better job of. And one of the number one things was, I wish I'd have done a better job of recording and documenting when I received certain evidence, when, where, and how, because in later years, you find that you come back to that. You may have a fact on an individual in your family tree, and you're sitting there wondering, where did I get this from? I don't even remember how I determined that this person was born in Macon County, Alabama. Well, that's where it becomes very important that the minute you come across information, note it, reference, note the date that you received it and how you received it. Because you may find other sources, other secondary sources that may report different locations. And you want to keep a record of all of that so that you can later go back and assess which one is the viable evidence, which is the one that sounds, like it's consistent, that it sticks. So you want to be careful with some of those common pitfalls. So I know I've covered a lot of information here. And for beginners, you want to take your time, just be patient with yourself, take your time, watch this video as many times as you need to help you retain the information, and just practice little by little. Your ancestors aren't going anywhere, right? So, but I hope that this information has been helpful to you, and I wish you well on your journey. So take care and good luck.